They tried to shame the virgin girl in court, but the loner rancher brought her the marriage papers. The courthouse in Dusty Creek was packed tighter than a sardine can on that sweltering Tuesday morning in August of. Every wooden pew creaked under the weight of curious townsfolk who had abandoned their morning chores to witness what promised to be the most scandalous trial the territory had seen in years. The air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, chewing tobacco, and the particular brand of malicious excitement that only comes when decent folk gather to watch someone else's downfall. At the defendant's table sat Mary Catherine Holloway, her spine rigid as a fence post, despite the trembling in her hands. At 19 she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that made men stammer and women whisper, auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, green eyes that held depths of intelligence most folks weren't comfortable acknowledging in a woman, and a face that belonged on a cameo brooch. Today, however, that beauty was shadowed by the weight of accusation and the very real possibility of losing everything she'd worked to build. The charges were as serious as they were humiliating: fraud, deception, and conduct unbecoming of a woman of supposed virtue. The prosecution claimed that Mary Catherine had deliberately misrepresented herself to secure a loan from the Dusty Creek Territorial Bank, using her reputation for moral purity as collateral when she had neither money nor property to offer. Worse yet, they alleged she had engaged in illicit relations with multiple men around town, making her supposed virginity and therefore her word worthless. Judge Cornelius Blackwood, a man whose jowls shook when he spoke and whose reputation for harsh sentences was legendary throughout the territory, peered down at Mary Catherine over his wire-rimmed spectacles. His gavel had already fallen like thunder once that morning when the crowd's murmuring had grown too loud for his liking. "Miss Holloway," Judge Blackwood's voice boomed across the packed courtroom, "you stand accused of obtaining money under false pretenses. The prosecution contends that you deliberately presented yourself as a woman of unquestionable virtue to secure a loan of $200 from this town's bank, when in fact you had already compromised yourself with various gentlemen of questionable character. How do you answer these charges?" Mary Catherine rose slowly, her worn blue dress, the nicest she owned, rustling softly in the sudden silence. "I answer that I am innocent of all charges, Your Honor. I have never compromised myself with any man, nor have I misrepresented my character to obtain any loan." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd like wind through wheat. In the front row, Ezra Maddox, the bank president, sat with his arms crossed and a satisfied smirk playing across his thin lips. Next to him, his son Roland, a young man whose good looks were overshadowed by the cruelty in his pale blue eyes, watched Mary Catherine with the intensity of a hawk eyeing a mouse. It was Roland who had started this whole mess. 3 months ago, he had cornered Mary Catherine behind Henley's General Store and attempted to force his attentions upon her. When she had fought him off and threatened to tell his father, Roland had laughed and told her that no one would believe the word of a nobody against a mad. But Mary Catherine had underestimated the vindictive nature of a spurned man with power and connections. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of whispered rumors and paid testimony. 3 men had come forward to swear that Mary Catherine had engaged in improper relations with them, though their stories contradicted each other on crucial details like when and where these alleged encounters had taken place. The bank president testified that Mary Catherine had specifically mentioned her unblemished reputation when applying for the loan to start her seamstress business, though no one could produce any written documentation of such claim. Mary Catherine's court-appointed lawyer, a nervous young man named Theodore Priestley, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, made a valiant but fumbling attempt at her defense. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the testimonies, the lack of physical evidence, and the suspicious timing of the accusations coming as they did just after Mary Catherine had rejected the romantic advances of certain prominent citizens. But in a town where the Maddox family owned the bank, the largest ranch, and had the ear of the judge, the truth seemed to matter less than keeping the powerful happy. "Your Honor," announced District Attorney Harrison Cobb, a man whose political ambitions were as transparent as his receding hairline, "we intend to prove beyond any doubt that Miss Holloway is a woman of loose morals who deliberately deceived this community." To that end we request permission to conduct a physical examination that will determine once and for all whether the defendant is indeed the virgin she claims to be." The courthouse erupted in shocked gasps and excited murmurs. Mary Catherine's face went white as parchment, her hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table so tightly her knuckles showed through her skin. "You can't be serious," stammered Theodore Priestley, shooting to his feet. "Such an examination would be a violation of my client's most basic dignity and privacy. This is a court of law, not a medieval torture chamber." Judge Blackwood's gavel cracked like a gunshot, silencing the crowd. "Sit down, Mr. Priest. The request, while unusual, is not without precedent in cases where a woman's virtue is central to the charges. Given that Miss Holloway's alleged purity was supposedly the basis for extending her credit, the court finds that such an examination is relevant to determining the truth of the matter." Mary Catherine stood up slowly, her voice steady despite the tremor running through her body. "Your Honor, I submit to the jurisdiction of this court in all legal matters, but I will not submit to such an indecent and barbarous procedure. If that is what passes for justice in Dusty Creek, then I would rather be found guilty and maintain my dignity." The crowd buzzed with excitement at this dramatic turn. Some of the women looked horrified, while others seemed to lean forward with morbid curiosity. The men's faces showed a mixture of embarrassment and anticipation that made Mary Catherine's stomach turn. "Miss Holloway," Judge Blackwood said with what might have been intended as paternal concern, "I understand your reluctance, but this is a serious matter. If you refuse to cooperate with the court's reasonable requests, I'm afraid I'll have no choice but to assume you have something to hide. The examination will be conducted by Dr. Minerva Thornfield, a woman of impeccable reputation, in the privacy of my chamber. Surely you can see that this is the most expedient way to resolve this matter and clear your name." Dr. Thornfield, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who served as the town's only female physician, nodded grimly from her seat in the gallery. Mary Catherine knew her to be a fair woman, but also one who wouldn't hesitate to report exactly what she found, regardless of the consequences. "I won't do it," Mary Catherine said quietly, but her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "I won't be subjected to such humiliation for the entertainment of this court and the satisfaction of those who seek to destroy me." Judge Blackwood's face darkened. "Miss Holloway, you are in contempt of this court. If you continue to refuse a reasonable request for evidence, I will be forced to find you guilty of all charges and sentence you immediately." Mary Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her situation crushing down on her like a fallen tree. Guilty meant prison, possibly years of. It meant the end of her dreams of opening her seamstress shop, the end of any hope for a respectable future. But submitting to the examination felt like a different kind of death, the death of her dignity and self-respect. The courthouse doors burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. The sound of spurs jangling and boot heels striking the wooden floor echoed through the sudden silence, as a tall figure strode down the center aisle with purposeful steps. Nathaniel Nate Cordell was a man who commanded attention without asking for it. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that filled his worn leather jacket and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who believed in straight lines and sharp angles, he was the kind of man who made other men step aside and women peek at him from behind their fans. His dark hair showed streaks of premature gray at the temples, and his blue eyes held the kind of hard-earned wisdom that only comes from surviving things that kill lesser men. Nate owned a spread about 20 miles north of town, a modest operation that he worked alone, turning down all offers of help and keeping to himself with a dedication that had earned him a reputation as the most solitary man in 3 counties. Some folks said he was running from some. Others claimed he was just naturally antisocial. What everyone agreed on was that Nathaniel Cordell was a man you didn't cross unless you were tired of breathing. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he conducted his business quickly and quietly before disappearing back into the wilderness. Most of the townsfolk couldn't remember the last time they'd seen him inside a building, much less the courthouse. His sudden appearance now sent a ripple of whispered speculation through the crowd. Nate walked directly to the front of the courtroom, his spurs singing with each step, and stopped before Judge Blackwood's bench. From inside his jacket he pulled out a folded document and placed it on the bailiff's desk. "Your Honor," Nate said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen whether they wanted to or not, I'm here to present evidence relevant to this case. Judge Blackwood looked down at him with irritation and curiosity in equal measure. Mr. Cordell, this court is currently in session. If you have business here, you'll need to wait until this can't wait, Nate interrupted smoothly. The document I've just presented is a marriage certificate properly filed with the territorial government 3 days ago. Miss Mary Catherine Holloway is now Mrs. Mary Catherine Cordell, and as her legal husband, I'm here to inform this court that any examination of my wife's person without my consent would constitute assault. The courthouse exploded into chaos. Voices raised in surprise, anger and confusion as people craned their necks to get a better look at the marriage certificate. Mary Catherine stared at Nate in complete shock, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Theodore Priestley looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Judge Blackwood's gavel pounded repeatedly as he tried to restore order. Mr. Cordell, what is the meaning of this? When exactly did this alleged marriage take place? Nate reached into his jacket again and produced a second document. 3 days ago in Carson City, Your Honor. Here's the certificate, signed by Justice of the Peace William Morrison and properly witnessed. I can provide affidavits from the witnesses if needed. District Attorney Cobb shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. Your Honor, this is obviously a desperate ploy to circumvent the court's authority. Even if this marriage is legitimate, it doesn't change the fact that the defendant obtained money under false pretenses weeks ago. Actually, Nate said calmly, it changes everything. The loan in question was applied for and granted to Miss Holloway as a single woman. However, according to territorial law, any debts incurred by a woman before marriage become the responsibility of her husband upon wedding. As of 3 days ago, that debt legally transferred to me. He reached into his jacket a third time and pulled out a thick envelope. I'm here to pay it in full, plus interest. The envelope landed on the bailiff's desk, with a heavy thunk that suggested it contained significantly more than $200. Judge Blackwood gestured for the bailiff to bring him both the marriage certificate and the money. Ezra Maddox lurched to his feet, his face a mask of fury. This is preposterous. You can't just waltz in here and— Miss Maddox, Judge Blackwood said sharply, you will sit down and remain silent or I'll have you removed from my courtroom. The bank president sat down heavily, but his glare could have melted steel. Judge Blackwood examined the marriage certificate with the thoroughness of a man looking for any excuse to reject it. After several tense minutes, he looked up at Nate with grudging respect. This appears to be in order, Mr. Cordell. However, the question remains, when exactly did you marry Miss Holloway, and why should this court believe that this marriage is anything more than a convenient legal fiction designed to circumvent justice? Mary Catherine found her voice at last. Your Honor, I can explain. No need, Miss Cordell, Nate said gently, using her new name for the first time in front of the crowd. The sound of it sent a strange thrill through Mary Catherine that she couldn't quite identify. Your Honor, my wife and I were married in Carson City 3 days ago after a brief courtship conducted primarily through correspondence. I had been seeking a suitable wife, and Mary Catherine had been recommended to me by mutual acquaintances as a woman of excellent character and strong moral fiber. This was news to Mary Catherine, who was still trying to process the fact that she was apparently married to a man she'd barely spoken to more than a dozen times in her life. She had a vague memory of Nate appearing at her boarding house 3 nights ago, looking uncomfortable and speaking in urgent, low tones about a solution to her legal troubles. She'd been so panicked and desperate that the details had blurred together, but she definitely remembered signing papers and taking a harrowing midnight ride to Carson City. The timing may seem convenient, Nate continued, but the fact remains that the marriage is legal and binding. The debt has been transferred to me and is now paid in full. Furthermore, as Mrs. Cordell's husband, I have the legal right to protect her from any procedure or examination that I deem inappropriate or unnecessary. District Attorney Cobb was practically foaming at the mouth. Your Honor, surely the court can see through this obvious deception. Mr. Cordell has clearly orchestrated this entire charade to prevent justice from being served. Judge Blackwood held up a hand for silence. The courtroom fell quiet enough to hear a pin drop. Mary Catherine could feel her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Mr. Cobb, the judge said slowly, while the timing of this marriage is certainly convenient for the defendant, I find no legal grounds to challenge its validity. The certificate appears authentic, the witnesses are reputable, and the jurisdiction is proper. Furthermore, Mr. Cordell is correct about territorial law regarding marital debt transfer. The original debt that formed the basis of these charges has been paid in full, which significantly undermines the prosecution's case. Cobb's political ambitions were crumbling before his eyes. But Your Honor, what about the other charges? The accusations of improper conduct? Surely those still stand. Nate stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the grip of the Colt .45 that hung low on his hip. The gesture wasn't threatening, exactly, but it reminded everyone in the room that Nathaniel Cordell was not a man to be trifled with. As for those accusations, Nate said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, I'd like to ask the gentleman who made them to step forward and repeat their claims about my wife to my face. The three men who had testified against Mary Catherine suddenly found the floor extremely interesting. None of them seemed eager to lock eyes with the tall rancher whose reputation with a gun was as well established as his preference for solitude. The first accuser, a drifter named Pete Hutchins, who worked odd jobs around town, shifted nervously in his seat. The second, Tom Bradley, who ran a small freight business, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. The third, Jake Morrison, a local ranch hand with a reputation for drinking and fighting, actually started to rise from his seat, but a sharp look from his employer made him sit back down quickly. Come now, gentlemen, Nate said conversationally, though his eyes held all the warmth of a winter storm. Surely you're not going to let a little thing like my presence stop you from telling the truth about my wife's alleged indiscretion. After all, if these encounters really happened, you have nothing to fear from me. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mary Catherine watched Nate with a mixture of amazement and growing understanding. She was beginning to realize that this man had not just saved her from legal destruction, he had walked into a room full of her enemies, and dared them to continue their assault on her character. Finally, Pete Hutchins cleared his throat and mumbled something unintelligible. I'm sorry, Nate said, cupping his ear in an exaggerated gesture. I didn't quite catch that. Could you speak up? I said maybe I was mistaken, Hutchins said louder, his voice cracking slightly. Maybe it wasn't her after all, could have been someone else. Tom Bradley nodded vigorously. Yeah, now that I think about it, it was probably that girl from the saloon. They all look alike in the dark. Jake Morrison, who had more courage than sense, stood up slowly. I know what I saw and I ain't taking it back just because some. He never finished the sentence. Nate's hand didn't move toward his gun, didn't make any threatening gesture at all. He simply looked at Jake Morrison with the kind of steady measuring gaze that a man might use when deciding whether something was worth the trouble of killing. Morrison sat down abruptly, his face pale. I think I might have been drinking that night, Morrison muttered, memory's a bit fuzzy. Judge Blackwood watched this exchange with growing irritation. Mr. Cobb, it appears that your witnesses are recanting their testimony. Do you have any other evidence to present? The district attorney looked around the courtroom desperately, searching for some way to salvage his case. His eyes fell on Roland Maddox, who had been sitting in sullen silence since Nate's arrival. What about Mr. Maddox? Surely he can speak to the defendant's character. Roland shifted uncomfortably under the collective gaze of the courtroom. He opened his mouth to speak, then caught sight of Nate's expression, and apparently thought better of it. The look in the rancher's eyes suggested that he knew exactly who was responsible for Mary Catherine's troubles, and what he might do about it. I don't really know Miss Cordell well enough to comment on her character, Roland said finally, each word seeming to stick in his throat. Ezra Maddox looked like he was about to have an apoplectic fit. Roland, tell them about Pa, Roland interrupted sharply. I said I don't know her well enough to comment. Judge Blackwood had seen enough. The prosecution's case was falling apart faster than a house of cards in a windstorm, and he could read the political winds as well as anyone. The Maddox family might have influence, but Nathaniel Cordell had something more powerful. The respect that comes from being known as a man who keeps his word and settles his accounts. Miss Cobb, the judge said with finality, in light of the payment of the debt, the recanting of witness testimony, and the lack of any physical evidence supporting the charges, this court finds insufficient grounds to proceed. All charges against Mrs. Mary Catherine Cordell are hereby dismissed. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and the courtroom erupted in a babble of voices. Some people seemed disappointed that the entertainment was over, while others appeared genuinely happy that Mary Catherine had escaped what had seemed like certain doom. Through it all, Mary Catherine sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything that had just happened. Nate appeared at her side, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "Mrs. Cordell, perhaps we should step outside and discuss our arrangement." Mary Catherine took his arm on unsteady legs, feeling like she was walking through a dream. The crowd parted before them as they made their way toward the courthouse doors, some people offering congratulations, others just staring in fascination at the unlikely couple. Outside, the afternoon sun seemed blindingly bright after the dim interior of the courthouse. Mary Catherine blinked in the harsh light, trying to adjust both her vision and her understanding of her new reality. "I don't understand," she said finally, turning to face Nate. "Why did you do this? Why did you marry me? We barely know each other." Nate removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that somehow made him seem more human and less like a force of nature. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because what was happening in there wasn't justice. It was a lynching with legal trappings." "But marriage," Mary Catherine shook her head. "Marriage is supposed to be about love, about building a life together. What you've done is practical," Nate finished for her. "Look, Mary Catherine, Mrs. Cordell, I'm not going to pretend this is some romantic fairy tale. I'm a man who lives alone by choice and you're a woman who needed help, but that doesn't mean this arrangement can't work for both of us." Mary Catherine studied his face, searching for some clue to what he was thinking. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership," Nate said after a moment. "You need protection and a fresh start. I need," he paused, seeming to struggle with the word, "I need someone who isn't afraid of hard work and who won't try to change me into something I'm not. My ranch is isolated, but it's profitable. There's enough space for you to set up your seamstress business if that's what you want, or to try something else entirely. And what about the personal aspects of marriage?" Nate's cheeks actually colored slightly, which Mary Catherine found oddly endearing. "That would be entirely up to you. I'm not the kind of man who forces himself on women, married or otherwise. If someday you decide you want more than just a business arrangement, we can discuss it. If not, I'll respect that." Mary Catherine was quiet for a long moment, watching the people of Dusty Creek go about their daily business. A few of them glanced in her direction, but she could see that the dynamic had already shifted. Where once she had been Mary Catherine Holloway, the disgraced woman facing prison, she was now Mrs. Nathaniel Cordell, wife of a respected rancher. The protection that came with his name was almost tangible. "What made you decide to help me?" she asked. "We've spoken maybe a dozen times, and never about anything more significant than the weather." Nate was quiet for so long that Mary Catherine began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for things you didn't do. I know what it's like to have people make up their minds about you based on rumors and assumptions." He looked out toward the mountains that ringed the valley, his eyes distant. "And because I saw you fight off Roland Maddox behind the general store 3 months ago. I saw how you handled yourself, and I saw how he threatened you afterward." Mary Catherine stared at him in shock. "You saw that?" "I was picking up supplies, heard the commotion and came to investigate." Nate's jaw tightened. "I've been keeping an eye on things since then, waiting to see what he'd try next. When the charges were filed, it wasn't hard to figure out who was behind them. Why didn't you help me then? Why wait until now?" Nate finally looked at her directly, and Mary Catherine was surprised by the vulnerability she saw in his eyes. "Because I'm not a knight in shining armor, Mary Catherine. I'm just a man who's spent the last 10 years learning to live with his mistakes and his regrets. I wasn't sure I had the right to insert myself into your life, even to help. But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway," he confirmed, "because watching them try to destroy you in that courtroom was more than I could stomach." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Mary Catherine spoke. "Your ranch, is it really isolated? 20 miles from town, tucked back in a valley that doesn't even have a name. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away. It's beautiful country, but it's not for everyone. The winters are hard, and the work is harder. There's no society to speak of, no ladies' circle or church socials." Mary Catherine thought about her cramped room in Miss Henderson's boarding house, where the walls were thin and the other residents gossiped constantly. She thought about the suspicious looks she'd been getting around town ever since Roland's accusations started spreading. She thought about the very real possibility that even with the charges dropped, her reputation in Dusty Creek might never recover. "It sounds peaceful," she said finally. Nate studied her face carefully. "Are you sure about this? Once we leave town as husband and wife, there's no going back. People will expect us to make it work." Mary Catherine considered this. The woman who had walked into the courthouse that morning had been facing the destruction of everything she'd hoped to build for herself. The woman standing here now was married to a man who had risked his own reputation to save hers, who had paid her debts without being asked, and who was offering her a chance to start over in a place where no one knew her story. "Miss Cordell, Nate, I want you to know that I meant what I said in court. I have never compromised myself with any man. The accusations were lies, all of them." "I know," Nate said simply. "I never doubted it." The quiet certainty in his voice nearly brought tears to Mary Catherine's eyes. After weeks of having her word questioned and her character attacked, his simple faith in her honesty was almost overwhelming. "Then yes," she said, squaring her shoulders with the same determination that had gotten her through the trial. "I'm sure. When do we leave?" "First thing tomorrow morning. That'll give you time to pack your things and say any goodbyes you need to say." Nate settled his hat back on his head, transforming himself once again into the intimidating figure who had stridden into the courthouse. "I'll pick you up at Mrs. Henderson's at dawn." As Mary Catherine watched him walk away, his spurs jingling softly with each step, she realized that her life had just taken a turn that she never could have imagined. She was married to a virtual stranger, about to leave the only home she'd known since her parents died, heading for an isolated ranch in the wilderness. And for the first time in months, she felt something that had been notably absent from her life. The next morning arrived gray and cool, with wisps of fog clinging to the mountains like smoke. Mary Catherine stood on the porch of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house with her 2 worn suitcases and a trunk containing her sewing supplies, watching the empty street for any sign of her husband. The word still felt strange in her mind. Husband, Mrs. Cordell, a name that carried weight and protection, even if it was still unfamiliar on her tongue. Miss Henderson, a plump woman with kind eyes and an unfortunate tendency to gossip, hovered nearby with the obvious intention of getting a closer look at Nathaniel Cordell when he arrived. "I still can't believe it," the older woman said for the 3rd time that morning. "Married to Nate Cordell. Nobody even knew he was looking for a wife. How long have you two been corresponding?" Mary Catherine had spent a good portion of the previous evening inventing a plausible courtship story to explain their sudden marriage. "Several months," she said vaguely. "He's a very private man, as you know." "Indeed he is. Why, I don't think I've seen him in town more than a dozen times in the past 5 years. What's his ranch like?" "I've heard it's quite remote." Before Mary Catherine could answer, the sound of horses and wagon wheels on the packed dirt street announced Nate's arrival. He drove a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 well-matched bay horses, and he'd clearly made an effort to clean up for the occasion. His dark hair was neatly combed, his clothes were freshly washed, and he'd even shaved off the stubble that had darkened his jaw the day before. He climbed down from the wagon with easy grace and touched the brim of his hat politely to Mrs. Henderson before turning to Mary Catherine. "Good morning, Mrs. Cordell. Ready to go home?" The word home sent a little thrill through Mary Catherine that she tried not to analyze too close. "Good morning, yes, I'm ready." Nate loaded her belongings into the wagon with efficient movements, securing everything carefully against the jolting ride ahead. Mrs. Henderson watched every move with bright, curious eyes. "Miss Cordell," she said as he helped Mary Catherine up onto the wagon seat, "you must promise to bring your wife to visit soon. We'll all be so curious to hear how you're settling in." "Yes, ma'am," Nate replied politely, though Mary Catherine got the impression that such visits would be few and far between if he had anything to say about it. As they drove through the quiet streets of Dusty Creek, Mary Catherine found herself looking at everything with new eyes. This had been her home for 3 years, ever since she'd arrived with nothing but her sewing skills and a determination to make her own way in the world. Now she was leaving it behind for an uncertain future, with a man she barely knew. They were just passing the bank when the door opened and Roland Maddox stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk. He saw them immediately and his face darkened with an expression of such pure malevolence that Mary Catherine instinctively moved closer to Nate on the wagon seat. Roland started to step into the street, apparently intending to intercept them, but Nate's calm, steady gaze met his across the distance. Whatever Roland saw in those blue eyes made him stop dead in his tracks. After a moment that seemed to stretch for eternity, Roland stepped back onto the sidewalk and watched them pass with the frustrated fury of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a better player. Once they were clear of town, Nate glanced at Mary Catherine with something that might have been concern. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, though her hands were still trembling slightly. I didn't expect to see him." "Roland Maddox is a coward who picks on people he thinks can't fight back," Nate said matter-of-factly. "He won't bother you again." Mary Catherine looked at her husband's profile as he guided the horses along the winding mountain road. There was something implacable about him, a sense of controlled strength that made her believe his words absolute. Roland might be vindictive and cruel, but he wasn't stupid enough to go up against Nathaniel Cordell. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape became increasingly wild and beautiful. Pine trees towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and green. Mountain streams tumbled down rocky slopes, their music mixing with the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves and the creaking of the wagon wheels. "Tell me about your ranch," Mary Catherine said as they paused to rest the horses at a scenic overlook. Far below them, the valley spread out like a patchwork quilt, with Dusty Creek looking small and insignificant in the distance. Nate leaned against the wagon wheel, his expression softening, as he looked out over the wilderness. "It's not much by some standards. 500 acres, most of it grazing land. I run about 200 head of cattle, some horses. The house is solid. I built it myself when I first came out here. It's got 4 rooms, a good fireplace, and windows that actually let in light." "What made you choose such an isolated spot?" Nate was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I came here looking for solitude. Found it too. Sometimes I go weeks without seeing another human being. That must be lonely." "I thought it was what I wanted," Nate said, his voice so quiet that Mary Catherine had to strain to hear it. "Maybe it was for a while, but lately," he trailed off, seeming to realize that he was revealing more than he'd intended. Mary Catherine didn't push. She was beginning to understand that Nathaniel Cordell was a man who shared his thoughts carefully, and she sensed that whatever had driven him to seek such complete isolation was something he wasn't ready to discuss with a virtual stranger, even one who happened to be his wife. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took Mary Catherine's breath away. The valley that Nate called home was everything he had promised, a hidden paradise surrounded by towering mountains, with a clear stream running through the center, and meadows that stretched toward the horizon. The house sat on a slight rise overlooking the valley, built of solid logs and native stone that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. It was larger than Mary Catherine had expected, with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and windows that gleamed warmly in the fading light. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and meant it. There was something about this place that spoke to her soul, a sense of peace and rightness that she had never found in town. Nate seemed pleased by her reaction. "Come on, let me show you inside." The interior of the house was as solid and well-crafted as the exterior. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, comfortable furniture that showed signs of careful maintenance, and shelves lined with more books than Mary Catherine would have expected. The kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, with a modern stove and plenty of storage. 2 bedrooms opened off the main room, and Nate showed her to the larger of the 2. "This will be your room," he said, setting her suitcases on the hand-carved bureau. "I've been using the smaller one, so you don't need to worry about sharing space unless you want to." Mary Catherine looked around the room, taking in the comfortable bed with its handmade quilt, the rocking chair by the window, and the washstand with its flowered basin and pitcher. Someone had put thought and care into making this space welcoming, and she suspected that someone was Nate himself. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I know this arrangement isn't what either of us planned, but I want you to know that I'll do my best to be a good wife to you." Nate studied her face in the lamplight, his expression unreadable. "Mary Catherine, I want you to understand something. You don't owe me anything just because I helped you out of a bad situation. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be, and you should never feel like you have to earn your place here." The simple kindness in his words nearly undid her completely. After months of feeling like she was constantly on trial, constantly having to prove her worth and defend her character, the idea of unconditional acceptance was almost too much to believe. "I don't know what I did to deserve your help," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Maybe you didn't do anything, Nate replied. Maybe sometimes people just help each other because it's the right thing to do. As Mary Catherine settled into her new life as Mrs. Nathaniel Cordell, she began to understand that she had gained far more than just protection and a fresh start. She had found a partner who valued her strength, respected her independence, and offered her something she had never thought to hope for, a place where she could build a future entirely on her own terms. And if someday that future included the kind of love she had once dreamed of, well, stranger things had happened in the wild country where anything was possible, and second chances grew as freely as the mountain wildflowers.